The map stopped me before the history did. Not a modern map, an old one, drawn in 1737 by a French cartographer named Philippe Boitch, sitting in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, catalogued under a reference number most researchers never request. The empire it depicted, its roads, its administrative boundaries, its network of cities, did not match any empire I had been taught to recognize. And yet the detail was extraordinary. Too extraordinary to be invented. Someone had seen this place. Someone had measured it. Someone had written it down. And then, at some point, someone had made a decision about what the world would remember. I spent 3 months trying to understand who made that decision. What I found wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No smoke-filled room. No single villain burning scrolls at midnight. What I found was something quieter and, in many ways, more disturbing. Pattern. Repeated across centuries, across continents, across institutions that had every reason to rewrite the past and every resource to do it. The pattern suggested that the history of at least one major civilizational complex, its reach, its sophistication, its very name, had been systematically compressed, reattributed, and in some cases simply omitted from the record that would eventually become the consensus that we teach children today. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But stay with me because the archive doesn't lie. Only the people who control it do. The official story goes like this. Human civilization emerges from a handful of recognized cradles: Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus, the Yellow River Basin. These cradles develop in relative isolation, eventually producing the classical empires we know: Rome, Persia, Han China, the Maurya. Between these anchors, the ancient world is understood as a mosaic of smaller kingdoms, tribal confederations, and regional cultures, interconnected by trade but fundamentally local. The great synthesis, we are told, comes later, with the Mongols, with the Islamic Golden Age, with European colonialism. This is a clean story. It has a shape. It has a timeline. It has beneficiaries. Let me be fair to the official narrative. It is not entirely wrong. The civilizations it names were real. The empires it describes left ruins you can still walk through, inscriptions you can still read, legal codes that survive in museum basements in Paris and London and Chicago. The scholarship that built this consensus was, in many cases, genuine and painstaking work by serious people. I am not dismissing it. I am asking what it left out, and why. Let's start with the numbers. When European antiquarians began systematically cataloging ancient ruins in the 18th and 19th centuries, they faced a classification problem that almost no one discusses today. The problem was volume. There were simply too many ruins in too many places that did not fit the accepted model of development. Sites that were too large. Trade goods found too far from their origin points. Linguistic similarities across regions that, according to the prevailing theory, had never been in contact. The British archaeologist Sir Austen Henry Layard, excavating in Mesopotamia in the 1840s, noted in his private correspondence now held at the British Museum under reference MS-ADD 38977, that certain administrative tablets he uncovered bore organizational structures more complex than anything the recognized Assyrian record should have produced at that date. He published his findings. Then he revised them. The revision, which appeared in his 1853 supplementary volume, quietly reclassified the anomalous tablets as provincial variations. The original assessment was not retracted. It was simply not referenced again. That's not revision. That's erasure with a footnote attached. Speaking of administrative structures, there is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it, of how institutional records from roughly the 3rd to 7th centuries interact with what should be their predecessor civilizations. The predecessor material is consistently thinner. Not absent, thin. The written record for what should be the height of a particular administrative complex. And empire historians now reference obliquely as the late antique synthesis, contains gaps that, mapped chronologically, cluster around very specific decades. Decades that also, not coincidentally, correspond to periods of aggressive manuscript collection by newly consolidated powers. The timing is almost theatrical. I found one of the most compelling threads while researching something else entirely. I was looking at the transmission history of Ptolemy's geography, the 2nd century text that became foundational to European cartography. The conventional account holds that the geography was lost in the West, preserved in the Byzantine East, and reintroduced to Western Europe via Arab intermediaries around the late 14th century. This is accurate as far as it goes. What it omits is the question of what the Byzantine and Arab scholars were working from when they produced their own syntheses, and what they chose not to transmit. The Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, writing his Tabula Rogeriana in 1154 for the Norman king Roger II of Sicily, produced a world map of extraordinary accuracy. Certain coastlines on his map, particularly in the Indian Ocean basin, display a cartographic precision that suggests access to navigational records substantially older than any officially recognized source. Al-Idrisi himself, in his accompanying text, refers repeatedly to the accounts of the ancient merchants and the records of those who came before the current kingdoms. He does not name the civilization these merchants belonged to. The name, apparently, was either unknown to him or unacceptable to record for his royal patron. Which brings me to the libraries. Between the 5th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, at least 11 major archival collections in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world were either destroyed, dispersed, or consolidated by newly dominant powers. This is not a secret. Historians acknowledge each of these events individually. What they rarely do is aggregate them and ask what the cumulative effect would have been on the documentary record of any large-scale predecessor civilization. The Library of Alexandria is the famous case, and precisely because it is famous, it has become almost useless as evidence, too mythologized to carry analytical weight. But consider the lesser-known destructions. The Sassanid Royal Archive at Ctesiphon, sacked in 637 CE. The library of the Nalanda monastic complex in Bihar, destroyed in approximately 1193 CE. Contemporary accounts by the monk Dharmasvaman, written 50 years after the event, describe 3 months of burning. The repository at Ani, the Armenian capital, which contained administrative records going back centuries, and which was comprehensively dismantled after 1064 CE. The Timbuktu manuscript collections, not the famous partial survival, but the earlier corpus, described in Ibn Battuta's 1352 account as vast, which has never been fully located. Each destruction on its own is a tragedy of history. Aggregated, they begin to look like something else. The part that keeps me up at night is not the destructions themselves. It is what happens in the generation immediately after each one. In every case, without a single exception in the historical record I have examined, the destruction of a major archive is followed within 30 to 60 years by a new historiographical project, commissioned by the new power, which produces a synthesized account of the past that positions the new power as the legitimate heir to whatever came before. The Abbasid Beit al-Hikmah, the Carolingian Scriptoria, the Ottoman Imperial Chancery under Suleiman, the British Colonial Archive Services in India and Egypt. The pattern indicates a methodology, not a conspiracy, a methodology, understood, repeated, institutionalized. Let me walk you through a specific case in detail because abstractions are easy to dismiss. What no one explains is how it looks when you find it in the primary sources. In the Vatican Apostolic Archive, accessible to scholars since 1881, though with significant restrictions on pre-1700 material, there exists a series of correspondence between papal legates and the Mongol court dating to the mid-13th century. These letters, some of which have been published in partial translation in the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, describe the Mongol imperial court's own historical self-understanding in terms that are startling. The Mongol Khans, according to their legate interlocutors, did not understand themselves as a new civilization. They understood themselves as the administrators of a much older system, one they had not invented but had conquered and were now operating. They referred to this older system by a name that appears in the Latin transcriptions as Tartarorum Antiqua Residential Publica, the ancient republic of the Tartars, but which, the legates note, the Mongols themselves called by a different term, rendered in the Latin phonetically as something close to Orda Magna Veterum, the Grand Orda of the Ancients. Historians who have examined these letters, and they are not widely examined. The specialist bibliography runs to fewer than 30 papers in the last century, generally interpret this terminology as Mongol imperial propaganda, a legitimization strategy. That is the mainstream reading. It may be correct, but there is another reading, and it is this: the Mongols were describing something real, something they had absorbed, something whose administrative infrastructure they were using, whose road systems they were maintaining, whose census methodologies they had inherited and adapted. If that reading is even partially correct, it implies a predecessor civilizational structure of enormous geographic scope, spanning the Eurasian steppe and its adjacent settled zones, that has no name in any standard historical taxonomy. An empire that the Mongols themselves described as ancient when they encountered it in the 13th century. Where did it go? Not where. When. And the answer to when is what should disturb us. Maybe the answer is simply dissolution. Empires dissolve. They leave traces that become unrecognizable over centuries. Maybe the predecessor structure the Mongols described was a loose cultural complex, not a state, and we are projecting coherence onto what was simply a network of shared practices and trade relationships. Maybe the cartographic anomalies are coincidence. Maybe Bwach's 1737 map was speculative, not documentary. Maybe the administrative tablet layered reclassified really was a provincial variation and not evidence of a more sophisticated parent system. Maybe the aggregate library destructions are a coincidence of timing. Maybe each new power that commissioned a historical synthesis was simply doing what new powers do, constructing legitimacy, rather than actively suppressing an account that would complicate that legitimacy. Maybe all of this is pattern matching applied to noise. But here's what matters. The question is not whether an erased empire existed in exactly the form I have been describing. The question is whether our current historical consensus has been shaped, actively, institutionally, over centuries by processes that were not neutral, by decisions made not in the interest of accuracy but in the interest of power, by the very human tendency of every new dominant system to see itself as the beginning of the story rather than a chapter in a much longer one. And on that question, the archive is not ambiguous. The evidence for deliberate historical restructuring is not circumstantial. It is documented. What I have found, sitting in the footnotes of academic papers that almost no one reads, buried in plain sight in the supplementary volumes of 19th century excavation reports, sealed in partial access collections in Rome and London and Istanbul, is a record of choices. Not accidents. Choices. The choice to reclassify anomalous tablets as provincial variations. The choice not to name the civilization Aladrice's ancient merchants came from. The choice to treat each archive destruction as an isolated tragedy rather than part of a cumulative pattern. The choice to interpret Mongol historical self-understanding as propaganda rather than memory. The choice, made in conference rooms and editorial committees and funding boards across 2 centuries of institutional scholarship, about which questions were worth pursuing and which were eccentric. These choices have consequences. They have consequences for how we understand the roots of legal systems still in operation today. They have consequences for how we understand the spread of agricultural practices, metallurgical techniques, mathematical concepts, innovations that appear in the standard account almost spontaneously in multiple locations, as if ideas simply emerge from the soil. They have consequences for how entire contemporary cultures understand their own depth, their own antiquity, their own contribution to the civilizational project. And they have consequences for what we teach children about where they came from. The timeline isn't subtle. In 1799, the Rosetta Stone is discovered and the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics begins, a process that, when completed, will reveal an Egyptian civilization far older and more sophisticated than European scholarship had previously acknowledged. In 1822, Champollion publishes his decipherment. In 1830, the first systematic attempts to professionalize historiography as an academic discipline begin in German universities. establishing the methodological frameworks that will dominate the field for the next century and a half. These frameworks, rigorous, citation-based, evidence-driven, are genuinely improvements. But they also institutionalize a set of periodizations and category systems that effectively cap the acknowledged complexity of preclassical civilization. The anomalies that don't fit are not refuted. They are unfunded. Speaking of funding, there is a particular kind of absence that requires money to maintain. Ruins do not excavate themselves. Archives do not catalog themselves. The decision about which sites to dig, which collections to process, which research questions to fund, these are not neutral decisions. They are decisions made by institutions with interests, operating within political contexts, responding to pressures that have nothing to do with the disinterested pursuit of historical truth. I don't say this to be cynical. I say it because it is documented, because the funding histories of major archaeological projects are themselves a matter of record, and because when you trace them, the pattern is consistent. The sites that would most likely yield evidence of large-scale preclassical complexity in certain regions have been, proportionally, the least funded. That's not absence. That's managed absence. There are historians who have seen this pattern. Not in the conspiratorial terms I have been using, that framing would end their careers, but in the careful, hedged language of academic challenge to prevailing paradigms. The archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, whose work on old European civilization was dismissed for decades before partial rehabilitation. The historian Cheikh Anta Diop, whose documentation of African civilizational antiquity was systematically marginalized in European and American academic contexts. The epigraphist Barry Fell, whose work on pre-Columbian transatlantic contact has never been definitively refuted, only institutionally ignored. The scholars who have worked on the Yonaguni monument, on the anomalous sophistication of Göbekli Tepe, on the implications of the Antikythera mechanism for our understanding of ancient technological capacity. None of these researchers are charlatans. Some of their specific claims are contested. But the pattern of their reception, the way institutional historiography has responded to challenges to the baseline narrative not with refutation but with marginalization, is itself evidence of something. At minimum, it is evidence of an investment in a particular account of the past that does not welcome revision. The archive still exists, though. Most of it. Scattered, restricted, underfunded, but extant. The Bwatch map is still in Paris. The layered correspondence is still in London. The Vatican legate letters are still in Rome. The Mongol court histories, in their Mongolian and Persian and Chinese versions, are still accessible to scholars with the right language skills and the right institutional affiliations. The manuscript fragments from Timbuktu that did survive, approximately 700,000 documents held by the Ahmed Baba Institute, remain largely untranslated, a library of the ancient world that sits unread in the Saharan heat while the world debates whether it contains anything important. I don't have answers, only patterns. What would it mean if there was an empire, call it what you want, give it whatever name the evidence eventually demands, that spanned a significant portion of the Eurasian African landmass in the period between what we call the ancient world and what we call the medieval world? An empire sophisticated enough to leave its cartographic fingerprints on a 1737 French map, its administrative logic in Mongol court memory, its trade networks in Al-Idrisi's ocean charts. An empire whose dissolution, whether through climate, conflict, or internal collapse, was gradual enough to be absorbed rather than dramatically ended, and therefore gradual enough to be forgotten, reattributed, and eventually written over by the civilizations that filled its structural vacuum.